I found out my wife had another husband. They've been married longer than we have. The wedding album fell out of the box and landed face up at my feet, showing my wife in a white dress I'd never seen before, kissing a man who wasn't me. I was in our attic looking for Christmas decorations on a Saturday morning in November, and the photo was dated 8 years before I'd even met her, except the timestamp in the corner said it was taken 6 months after our own wedding. My brain couldn't process it. I picked up the album with hands that had gone numb, flipped through page after page of Melissa in bridal white, this stranger's arm around her waist, both of them cutting cake and dancing and looking at each other the way she'd looked at me on what I'd thought was the happiest day of both our lives. The photographer's stamp on the back said the wedding had taken place in Portland, Oregon. We lived in Boston. Melissa had told me she'd never even been to Portland. I'd been married to Melissa for 7 years. We'd met at a mutual friend's art gallery opening, one of those pretentious events where people drink cheap wine and pretend to understand abstract paintings. She was standing in front of a canvas that was literally just blue paint with one red dot, and when I walked up, she turned to me and said, "I think it's supposed to represent the existential isolation of modern existence, but honestly, it just looks like someone sneezed." I'd laughed, and we'd spent the next 3 hours walking around the city, talking about everything and nothing. She was a freelance graphic designer, worked from home mostly, traveled occasionally for clients. She was funny and smart and beautiful in an understated way that made her even more attractive. 6 months later, I proposed. A year after that, we got married in a small ceremony with close friends and family. It had been, I'd thought, perfect. Now I was sitting on the dusty attic floor, surrounded by boxes of decorations I'd come up here to find, holding evidence that my entire marriage was built on a foundation of lies. I opened the album to the first page. There was an inscription in handwriting I recognized as Melissa's. "To my darling Richard, the love of my life, forever yours, Melissa Kensington." Kensington, not her maiden name, which was supposed to be Thompson, not my last name, which was Lawrence, a third name I'd never heard her use. I pulled out my phone and took photos of every page in that album, my hands shaking so badly that some of the shots came out blurred. Then I put the album back in the box exactly as I'd found it, grabbed the Christmas decorations, and climbed back downstairs on autopilot. Melissa was in the kitchen making coffee when I came down. She looked up and smiled at me, completely at ease, no guilt or nervousness in her expression. She asked if I'd found the decorations. I said yes, and set the boxes down in the living room. She came over and kissed my cheek, and I had to force myself not to recoil. I asked her what her plans were for the day. She said she had some design work to finish, then maybe she'd meet her friend Vanessa for lunch. Vanessa, who I'd met several times, who seemed like a real person with a real friendship with my wife. Or was that a lie too? Was anything about Melissa's life actually real? I told her I was going to run some errands, and she said okay, without looking up from her phone. Just a normal Saturday morning. Except, nothing was normal anymore, and I had no idea what to do with the information burning a hole in my brain. I drove to a coffee shop across town and sat in my car in the parking lot, looking at the photos I'd taken of that wedding album. Melissa and Richard, married in Portland. I pulled out my laptop and started searching. Richard Kensington, Portland, Oregon. It took about 15 minutes of searching through social media and public records, but I found him. Richard Kensington, age 41, software engineer at a tech company based in Portland. His Facebook profile was mostly private, but his profile picture showed him standing in front of what looked like a nice house in the suburbs. No obvious photos of Melissa, but that didn't mean anything if they were being careful. I tried searching for marriage records. Oregon made those public, and after some digging, I found it. Melissa Ann Thompson married Richard James Kensington on June 15th, 11 years ago. 11 years. They'd been married for 11 years. 4 years before I'd even met Melissa. My stomach lurched, and I thought I might throw up right there in the parking lot. How was this possible? How could someone be married to 2 people simultaneously? We lived together. We shared a bed, a mortgage, bank accounts. We spent weekends together, went on vacations, had a life. When was she seeing Richard? How did this even work logistically? I thought about her business trips. She traveled maybe once a month, sometimes for a few days at a time, said she was meeting with clients, working on projects that required her physical presence. I'd never questioned it because her work seemed legitimate. She brought home money, had a portfolio, talked about her projects with enough detail that it all seemed real. But now I was wondering if those trips were actually to Portland. If she had a whole other life there with Richard, a husband who presumably thought he was her only husband, just like I had. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I needed more information before I could confront her. If I went home now and accused her of bigamy, she'd have time to destroy evidence, to come up with explanations, to manipulate the situation. I needed to know everything first. I called in sick to work for Monday, told them I had food poisoning and would be out for a few days. Then I booked a flight to Portland, leaving Sunday morning. I had less than 36 hours to figure out my next move, and I was going to spend them gathering every piece of evidence I could find. When I got home that evening, Melissa asked how my errands had gone. I said fine, and went to my office, claiming I had some work to catch up on. Instead, I spent the next 4 hours going through our financial records, looking for patterns I'd missed before. The credit card statements were revealing once I knew what to look for. Melissa had her own card, which I rarely looked at since we kept our finances mostly separate and just split household expenses. But now I was seeing charges in Portland almost every month. Restaurants, gas stations, grocery stores. She'd been incredibly careful. Never anything obvious like hotel rooms or jewelry stores, just everyday expenses that would blend in. But they were there, a breadcrumb trail to a life I knew nothing about. I also found that she had a P.O. box in Portland. The address appeared on several bank statements for an account I'd never heard of. I tried to access the account online but didn't have the password. I took screenshots of everything, saved them to an encrypted folder on my laptop, and backed everything up to a cloud drive Melissa didn't know about. Sunday morning, I told Melissa I was going to visit my brother in New York for a couple of days. She didn't question it, just kissed me goodbye and told me to have fun. I drove to the airport, parked in long-term parking, and caught my flight to Portland. The whole time, I felt like I was in someone else's life. This couldn't be happening. People didn't actually live double lives like this, did they? That was the stuff of movies and true crime podcasts, not real marriages in suburban Boston. But the evidence was undeniable. The wedding photos, the marriage certificate, the credit card charges, it was all real. Melissa had been married to Richard Kensington for 11 years, and she'd married me 7 years ago without ever divorcing him, which meant our marriage wasn't even legal. I was what? A boyfriend, with a meaningless ceremony and a piece of paper that meant nothing? I landed in Portland just after noon Pacific time. I'd found Richard's address through a combination of public records and social media stalking. He lived in a nice neighborhood in the suburbs, exactly the kind of place Melissa and I had talked about moving to someday. I rented a car and drove past the house slowly. It was a 2-story Craftsman with a well-maintained yard and 2 cars in the driveway, a Toyota Camry and a Subaru Outback. The Camry was registered to Richard. The Outback was registered to Melissa Kensington. My wife had a car in Portland that I'd never known about. I parked down the street and waited, though I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Some kind of proof beyond what I already had? A chance to see them together? To confirm that this nightmare was actually real? At 3:15, the front door opened and Melissa walked out. Not someone who looked like Melissa. Actually, Melissa, wearing clothes I recognized, carrying a purse I'd seen her use. She got into the Outback and drove away. I followed her, staying a few cars back, feeling like a detective in a bad movie. She went to a grocery store, spent about 40 minutes inside, came out with bags that she loaded into the back of the car. Then she drove to what looked like a dry cleaner, went in, and came out with several items on hangers, just running normal errands, living a normal life, in Portland, with her other husband. I followed her back to the house, watched her park in the driveway and carry everything inside. A few minutes later, Richard came home in the Camry. I watched him park, watched him walk up to the front door, watched Melissa open it and kiss him. A real kiss, the kind married people give each other when they've been apart all day and are happy to be reunited. I sat in my rental car and watched the house until it got dark, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't an affair. This wasn't Melissa sneaking around behind my back with some guy she'd met. This was a whole separate marriage, a whole separate life, complete with a house and cars and daily routines. She was living as Melissa Kensington in Portland and Melissa Lawrence in Boston, somehow managing to keep both lives completely separate. The logistics of it were staggering. How did she keep track of everything? How did she maintain 2 marriages without either husband getting suspicious? I thought about our life in Boston, tried to remember if there had been signs I'd missed. She was always slightly vague about her childhood, said her parents had died when she was young, and she didn't like talking about it. She had no siblings, no family that I'd ever met. Her friends were mostly people she'd met through work, and while they seemed real enough, I'd never been particularly close with any of them. It was like she'd constructed her Boston life to be believable but lightweight, with no deep roots that would require too much explanation. I drove to a hotel and checked in, then spent the rest of the evening researching bigamy laws. In Massachusetts, where we'd gotten married, bigamy was a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The marriage between Melissa and me was legally void since she was already married to Richard. I had no legal standing as her husband. Any shared assets could potentially be claimed by Richard as the legal spouse. My head was spinning with the implications. I'd bought our house in Boston with money from my savings, but we'd put both names on the deed. Did that mean Richard could claim half of it? What about our joint bank account, the retirement funds we'd been building together? I needed a lawyer, but I also needed more information. I needed to know if Richard knew about me, if he was complicit in this deception or another victim like I was. Monday morning, I drove back to the house. Richard left for work at 8:30. Melissa's Outback stayed in the driveway. At 9:15, I walked up to the front door and knocked. When Melissa answered, the color drained from her face so fast, I thought she might faint. She stood there in the doorway, mouth opening and closing like a fish, unable to form words. I said, "We need to talk." She tried to shut the door, but I put my foot in the way. "You can talk to me here, or we can have this conversation in front of Richard when he gets home. Your choice." She let me in. The house was decorated in a style that was different from our Boston home, but somehow still very Melissa. Modern furniture, lots of plants, framed art on the walls. We sat in her living room, her and Richard's living room, and I waited for her to explain. She started crying immediately, which I'd expected. The tears felt manipulative, designed to make me feel guilty for confronting her, but I just sat there and waited. Finally, she started talking. She said she'd married Richard when she was young, just 23, and she'd thought she was in love. But over the years, the marriage had become stale, unfulfilling. She'd felt trapped. Then she'd met me at that art gallery, and she'd fallen in love for real, in a way she'd never experienced before. She'd meant to divorce Richard. She really had. But it was complicated. Richard's mother had terminal cancer at the time, and Melissa didn't want to add to the family's stress by filing for divorce. Then his mother died, and Richard was devastated, and she couldn't leave him in that state. And then time just kept passing, and she couldn't figure out how to extricate herself from either marriage without destroying everything. I listened to this explanation with a detachment that surprised me. She was describing her predicament like she was the victim here, like she'd been forced into this situation by circumstances beyond her control. I asked her if Richard knew about me. She shook her head. He had no idea she had another husband, another life. He thought her business trips were actually business trips, just like I had. I asked her how she'd managed it financially. She said she kept everything carefully separated. She had income from her actual graphic design work, which she reported to both of us, but split between her two lives. She had separate bank accounts, separate credit cards, separate everything. It was, she said, exhausting. Maintaining two marriages, two identities, two complete lives. She was always terrified she'd slip up, call Richard by my name or vice versa, mention something from one life while living in the other. I asked her if she loved either of us, or if we were both just parts of some elaborate game. She insisted she loved both of us, just in different ways. Richard was stable, secure, her partner in a comfortable life they'd built together. I was exciting, passionate, the relationship that made her feel alive. She'd never meant to hurt anyone. She'd just been trying to have everything she wanted, and she'd convinced herself that as long as no one found out, it wasn't really hurting anyone. I told her she was delusional if she thought this could continue indefinitely. She begged me not to tell Richard, said it would destroy him, that he didn't deserve to be hurt like this. I almost laughed. She was worried about protecting Richard from being hurt while actively deceiving both of us for years. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I told her I needed time to think about what I was going to do. She grabbed my arm, pleading with me to consider how much we'd built together, how good our life was, how this didn't have to change anything. I pulled away from her and left, drove back to my hotel, sat on the bed, and tried to figure out my next move. I should tell Richard. He deserved to know the truth just as much as I deserved to know it, but part of me was afraid of what that would unleash. If I told Richard, the whole house of cards would come tumbling down. Both marriages would end. There would be legal consequences for Melissa, and I'd be left sorting through the wreckage of a life that had never been real in the first place. But keeping the secret felt like becoming complicit in her deception, like choosing to live a lie just because the truth was too painful to face. I called a lawyer when I got back to the hotel, found one through a referral service, explained the situation in broad terms. Her name was Diane Foster, and she'd been practicing family law in Massachusetts for 23 years. She agreed to meet with me as soon as I got back to Boston, said this was one of the more unusual cases she'd encountered, but far from unprecedented. She asked if I had documentation. I said I had wedding photos, a marriage certificate, credit card statements, everything. She said that was good, that I'd need all of it. She also said I should consider whether I wanted to pursue criminal charges against Melissa for bigamy. I hadn't even thought about that angle. The idea of my wife going to prison felt surreal, but so did everything else about this situation. Diane said I should think about what outcome I actually wanted. Did I want revenge? Justice? Just to extricate myself from the marriage as cleanly as possible? I told her I didn't know yet, that I needed time to process. I flew back to Boston late Monday evening. Melissa was home when I got there, having presumably taken a red-eye back from Portland herself. She looked terrified when I walked in, like she expected me to start yelling or throwing things. Instead, I went straight to our bedroom, started packing a suitcase with enough clothes for a week. She followed me, asking where I was going, if we could please talk about this like adults. I told her I was staying at a hotel until I figured out what to do next. She said that was fair, that she understood I needed space, but could we please agree not to make any rash decisions? Not to tell anyone until we'd had time to really discuss this? I didn't agree to anything, just finished packing and left. Checked into a hotel near my office and tried to sleep, though my brain wouldn't shut off long enough to make that possible. The meeting with Diane Foster happened on Wednesday afternoon. I brought my laptop with all the evidence I'd compiled, the wedding photos, the marriage certificate from Oregon, the credit card statements showing Melissa's Portland expenses, screenshots of Richard's social media profiles, everything. Diane went through it all methodically, taking notes, asking clarifying questions. She confirmed that my marriage to Melissa was legally void since she was already married to Richard. I had no legal standing as her spouse. However, I might have claims to assets we'd acquired together, depending on how things were structured. The house was tricky since we'd both contributed to the mortgage, even though my down payment had funded the purchase. The The joint bank account could potentially be split, but it would all be complicated by the fact that Melissa had committed a felony, which changed the calculus significantly. Diane asked if I'd decided whether to report the bigamy to authorities. I said I still wasn't sure. She laid out the options. If I reported it, the police would investigate, Melissa would likely be arrested and charged, and there would be a criminal trial. That would be public, messy, and emotionally draining. The alternative was to pursue a civil annulment, get the marriage legally dissolved without involving criminal charges, and try to separate our assets as equitably as possible under the circumstances. That would be faster, more private, but it would mean Melissa faced no real consequences for what she'd done beyond losing both marriages. Diane said she couldn't tell me what to do, but she could tell me that clients who chose the revenge route often regretted it later. The satisfaction of seeing someone punished rarely outweighed the emotional cost of prolonged legal battles. I told her I needed more time to think about it. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. That evening, I called Richard Kensington. I'd been debating whether to contact him, whether it was my place to blow up his life the way mine had been blown up. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he deserved to know the truth. He was being deceived just as badly as I was. If our positions were reversed, I'd want someone to tell me. When he answered, I introduced myself and said I needed to talk to him about Melissa. There was a long pause. Then he asked how I knew his wife. I told him the truth. I was also married to Melissa. Had been for 7 years. We lived in Boston together, had a whole life together, and I'd just found out about him the previous weekend. Another long pause. Then Richard said, "This is a joke, right? Someone put you up to this." I told him it wasn't a joke and offered to send him proof. He gave me his email address, voice tight with something between anger and disbelief. I sent him everything. The photos from our wedding in Boston. Pictures of Melissa and me on vacations, at holidays, living our daily life. Copies of our joint bank statements. The deed to our house with both our names on it. 7 years of evidence that Melissa and I were married. Then I waited. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Richard sounded destroyed. Asked me to tell him everything I knew, how I'd found out, what Melissa had said when I confronted her. I walked him through the whole story, from finding the wedding album in our attic, to flying to Portland to watching their house. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was just silence on the other end of the line. Then he said, "She told me she had to travel for work. Graphic design clients all over the country. I never questioned it. Why would I? We've been married for 11 years. I thought I knew her." We talked for over an hour, comparing notes, finding all the places where Melissa's two lives intersected and how she'd managed to keep them separate. Richard told me about their marriage, how they'd met in college, how he'd proposed during a camping trip, how they'd built what he'd thought was a solid, happy life together. They'd talked about having kids, but Melissa had always said she wanted to wait until her career was more established. Now Richard was wondering if that had been another lie, another way to keep her Portland life from becoming too complicated. I told him about Diane Foster, about the legal options available to us. Richard said he wanted to pursue criminal charges. He wanted Melissa to face consequences for what she'd done, wanted everyone to know she was a liar and a criminal. I understood the impulse, but I also knew from my conversation with Diane that criminal prosecution would make everything more complicated. We agreed to meet in person. Richard flew to Boston the following weekend. We met at a bar downtown, two strangers bonded by the shared experience of being married to the same woman. He was tall, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he wasn't sleeping any better than I was. We got drunk together, which probably wasn't the smartest move, but it felt necessary. We toasted to being idiots. We laughed bitterly about how Melissa had managed to juggle 2 husbands for 7 years without either of us catching on. We shared stories about our respective marriages, finding eerie similarities in how Melissa had behaved with both of us. The same excuses for her travels, the same vague stories about her past, the same way of deflecting difficult conversations. It was like she'd used the same playbook for both relationships, just adjusted the details as needed. Richard asked if I'd talked to Melissa since I'd gotten back to Boston. I said no, that I'd been avoiding her calls and texts. He said he'd confronted her as soon as he'd gotten the evidence I sent. She'd admitted everything, tried the same explanations she'd given me about being trapped and not knowing how to extricate herself. Richard had told her to get out of the house. She'd been staying with a friend in Portland, calling him constantly, begging for another chance. He'd filed for divorce 2 days ago, citing fraud and bigamy. I told him I was planning to file for annulment on Monday. We agreed to coordinate our legal strategies, to make sure our lawyers were communicating so that Melissa couldn't play us against each other the way she'd been playing us for years. On Monday, I filed for annulment with Diane's help. The grounds were bigamy. Melissa had been legally married to Richard when she married me, rendering our marriage void from the start. I also filed a civil suit seeking to recover my share of assets we'd acquired together, including my down payment on the house and half the joint bank account. Melissa was served with papers at her friend's apartment in Portland. She called me immediately, hysterical, saying I was ruining her life, that she'd made mistakes but didn't deserve this. I told her she'd ruined her own life by making the choices she'd made. She said she was going to fight the annulment, that she'd hire a lawyer and prove that I'd known about Richard all along. that I was complicit. I told her to do whatever she needed to do, but she and I both knew that was a lie. There was no evidence of me knowing because I hadn't known. All the evidence pointed to her elaborate deception. The legal process moved slowly. Melissa did hire a lawyer, a guy named Kenneth Wright, who specialized in high-conflict divorces. His strategy seemed to be delay and obfuscate, filing motion after motion, demanding discovery of irrelevant documents, trying to drag things out in hopes that Richard and I would give up or settle for less than we deserved. But Richard and I were aligned. We shared information, coordinated through our lawyers, made sure we were presenting a united front. Diane said it was unusual for two people in our position to work together so effectively, but it made her job easier. Kenneth tried to paint us as vindictive ex-husbands ganging up on his poor client who'd made some mistakes, but was fundamentally a good person. The judge wasn't buying it. In a preliminary hearing, she looked at the evidence and said this was one of the clearest cases of fraud she'd seen. The annulment was likely to be granted without contest. About 3 months into the legal proceedings, Richard called me with news. The district attorney in Portland had decided to pursue criminal charges against Melissa for bigamy. Richard had filed a police report weeks earlier, but they'd initially said it was a civil matter and they wouldn't get involved. Something had changed. Maybe the DA's office had reviewed the evidence and decided it was worth prosecuting. Maybe they wanted to make an example of her. Either way, Melissa was facing felony charges that carried up to 5 years in prison. Richard sounded satisfied when he told me. Said maybe now she'd understand that actions had consequences. I felt less certain. The idea of Melissa in prison seemed too surreal, too extreme. But then I'd think about how she'd lied to both of us for years, how she'd built an entire false life, and I'd remind myself that she'd earned whatever consequences came her way. The criminal trial happened first, since criminal cases take priority over civil matters. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Melissa had married Richard in Oregon in 2013. She'd married me in Massachusetts in 2017 without divorcing Richard. She'd maintained both marriages simultaneously for 7 years, committing fraud against both husbands and violating state and federal bigamy laws. Kenneth Wright tried to argue that Melissa had genuinely believed her Oregon marriage was invalid due to some technicality, that she'd thought she was free to marry me, but he couldn't produce any evidence of this supposed technicality, and Melissa's own testimony undermined the defense. She admitted on the stand that she'd known both marriages were real, that she'd never believed otherwise. She just hadn't been able to bring herself to choose between us, so she'd tried to have both. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in prison plus 3 years of probation. It was less than the maximum, but more than Kenneth had argued for. The judge said she was being lenient because Melissa had no prior criminal record, but that the deliberate, sustained nature of the deception warranted real punishment. Melissa sobbed when the sentence was read. Her mother, who'd attended the trial, stood up and screamed that the sentence was too harsh, that Melissa had just been confused and scared. The judge gavelled her into silence. I watched it all from the gallery, feeling a strange emptiness. This was supposed to be satisfying, right? The person who'd wronged me was being punished. Justice was being served. But instead, I just felt tired. Tired of the anger. Tired of the legal proceedings. Tired of having my life defined by Melissa's betrayal. With the criminal case resolved, the civil matters moved forward. The annulment was granted, our marriage officially declared void from the beginning. The house in Boston was sold, and after paying off the mortgage, I got back my down payment plus half the equity. The joint bank account was split evenly. I ended up financially whole, more or less, though the emotional cost was harder to quantify. Richard went through a similar process with his divorce in Oregon. He got the house there, plus most of their shared assets, since Oregon courts took a dim view of Melissa's behavior. She lost almost everything, both marriages, both homes, her freedom, her reputation. Friends abandoned her. Her design clients dropped her. She went to prison with nothing but the clothes on her back and a stack of legal bills she'd never be able to pay. I tried to feel good about that, tried to convince myself that she'd gotten what she deserved, but mostly, I just felt hollow. The person I'd thought I was married to had never existed. Melissa the Boston wife was a character she'd played, a role she'd inhabited when she was with me. The real Melissa, whoever that was, remained a mystery. I'd spent 7 years living with someone I didn't know, building a life with someone who was fundamentally dishonest, and I had no idea how to reconcile that with the memories I had of our time together. Were any of those moments real? Had she ever genuinely loved me, or was I always just part of her elaborate game? Richard and I stayed in touch after everything was resolved. We'd meet for drinks every few months, two people bonded by trauma, trying to make sense of what had happened to us. He started dating again about a year after the divorce was finalized, said he was taking things slow, being very careful about trust. I understood that impulse. I'd tried dating too, but every relationship felt tainted by suspicion. I'd find myself checking backgrounds, looking for inconsistencies, waiting for the other shoe to drop. My therapist, Dr. Angela Morrison, who I'd started seeing shortly after filing for annulment, said this was normal. That being deceived so completely by someone you trusted would naturally make you hypervigilant in future relationships. She said healing would take time, that I needed to be patient with myself. 2 years after finding that wedding album in the attic, I got a letter from Melissa. She was out of prison, living in a halfway house in Oregon, working at a grocery store while she tried to rebuild her life. The letter was long, rambling, full of apologies and justifications. She said she'd had a lot of time to think about what she'd done, to understand why she'd made the choices she'd made. She'd been in therapy, working through childhood trauma. Her father had been emotionally abusive. She'd learned to compartmentalize and create false versions of herself to survive. Not an excuse, she said, but maybe an explanation. She hoped Richard and I could someday forgive her, not for her sake, but for our own. She said carrying anger and resentment would only hurt us in the long run. She wished us both happiness and peace. I read the letter twice, then put it in a drawer and forgot about it. Forgiveness felt impossible, unnecessary. I didn't need to forgive Melissa to move on with my life. I just needed to accept what had happened and build something new. Dr. Morrison said that was healthy, that forgiveness was personal, and I shouldn't feel obligated to offer it just because someone asked for it. Richard burned his copy of the letter, said he had no interest in Melissa's apologizes or explanations. He'd moved on, was engaged to a woman he'd met through friends, seemed genuinely happy. I was glad for him. At least one of us had managed to find something real after everything. I eventually met someone too. Her name was Diana, and she was nothing like Melissa. Straightforward, almost blunt in her honesty, with a career as an accountant that required precision and transparency. We met through a mutual friend, dated for a year before moving in together, were engaged another year after that. I told her everything about Melissa early on, wanted her to understand the baggage I was carrying. She listened without judgment, asked questions to understand what I'd been through, and said she appreciated my honesty. She said her own past relationships had taught her the value of clear communication and mutual trust. We built our relationship on those principles, deliberately choosing transparency even when it was uncomfortable. 3 years after finding that wedding album, I married Diana in a small ceremony with close friends and family. Richard came to the wedding, brought his fiancée. We toasted to second chances and new beginnings. My brother, who'd been my best man the first time around, gave a speech about resilience and the importance of choosing the right partner. He didn't mention Melissa by name, but everyone knew what he was talking about. Diana and I honeymooned in Ireland, deliberately choosing somewhere neither Melissa nor I had been together. I wanted memories that were purely ours, untainted by my past. When we got back, we moved into a new house we'd bought together, a place with no history beyond what we'd create. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.